Hey everyone, Thomas here. Just a quick heads up that this week's episode is a little bit different than normal. This week I had the privilege of interviewing Josh Gibbs to discuss his new book, Love What Lasts. If you haven't heard of Josh Gibbs before, Josh Gibbs is an educator. He is an author. He's a speaker, and we've discussed his work a number of times on the podcast. We've talked about his first book, Love What Lasts. We've talked about Something They Will Not Forget, his book of essays on Christmas. I think our episode is titled In Defense of Christmas. But we've covered his work a number of times. Josh has been on the podcast before to be interviewed for one of his earlier pamphlets, and it was a privilege to have him back. We talk about a few resources at the end of this conversation, but just want to put them at the front as well. If you're interested in picking up a copy of the book that we're going to discuss, which again is Love What Lasts, you can find that at cerseiinstitute.org. We also discussed that Josh has an upcoming online summer conference. So if you are an educator, if you are involved in classical education, you're going to want to check that out. That's at gibbsclassical.com/conference. You can find more information there. Again, gibbsclassical.com/conference. And if there's anything else about Josh that you're interested in learning about, your best bet is probably to check out gibbsclassical.com. I think that's all I have for intro, so I hope you enjoy this conversation between me and Josh Gibbs. Well, Josh Gibbs, welcome back to Classical Stuff You Should Know. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you back. We were talking just before we started recording, but I've really enjoyed Love What Lasts, your newest book. Was hoping to ask a couple questions around that book. I have a lot of questions about how you are writing so much. I think since we've last spoken, you put out a pamphlet, you put out your multiple articles a week, put out another book, and you just I hope this is public. You're talking about you're putting out another book later this year.
That's right.
So I have no idea how you do all that, but let's start with your most recent book, Love What Lasts. Let's just start from the beginning. Why did you want to write this book?
In the first chapter of the book, I described the experience that most immediately gave rise to the felt need to write it, which was a trip to the movie theater many years ago now, where my wife and I, it was a Friday and it was summer and we could see whatever we wanted. Our kids weren't with us, and the option really that was before us was Jurassic World 2, but I'd also heard really great things about First Reformed with Ethan Hawke, an actor I love. And so we were confronted with this choice, and we bought a ticket for the dinosaur movie, and we were very early, and while I sat in the theater waiting for this ridiculous dinosaur movie to begin, I tried to imagine what I would say to anyone who asked me to justify my choice. And I knew that First Reform was this movie getting great press, and it had been personally recommended to me by a number of friends. It was written by Paul Schrader, a director that I first became interested in back in the late 90s. I've loved Ethan Hawke ever since I saw Gattaca in 1997. I adore Ethan Hawke, who got the lead in this really juicy role about religion from a great Catholic writer. And I saw a dinosaur movie. And I was trying to imagine how I could possibly justify this decision to anybody that would ask me, why did you see this dumb dinosaur movie that you knew you were going to forget about the second you walked out of the theater when you could have seen First Reformed? And I realized as I was sitting in the theater waiting for the film to begin, there is no justification. This was just a bad decision. This was a worthless decision. I deserve to feel guilty. I deserve to feel very bad about this. And I think it was like a year after that I finally saw First Reformed.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was so good that I watched the first 45 minutes of it, and then I stopped it because I was so impressed with it. And I told my wife, we have to watch this together. I only watched the first 45 minutes. We have to watch it. And we watched it. And I ended up talking with a colleague about it, convincing him to watch it. We had this long conversation, and it was just an immensely profitable thing, spiritually profitable thing to have watched this movie.
Yeah.
And I almost didn't see this movie because I saw this dumb dinosaur movie instead. And it's a decision that I've made many times in my life to watch a dumb movie when I could watch a good one. And it struck me as a decision that many people are making on a regular basis, that we go to the theater and we see a better and a worse option, and so often we take the worst option.
Yeah.
And so kind of coupled with that, I've been teaching classic literature for many years, and I think it was probably 6 or 7 years ago now that I had a particular day at, in the classroom where I was teaching the same text 4 times over the course of a day to 4 different sections of 2 grades for weird scheduling reasons. At the end of the year, I was teaching Hamlet, and I was teaching the same scene from Hamlet 4 times in the course of a day. And I had this realization one time while I was teaching Hamlet for the 4th time. This is just as interesting the 4th time as it is the first time. And I often found that I hit my sweet spot in terms of lecturing and discussion the 3rd or 4th time that I was doing it. And so, I think all of these things kind of combine into the argument of the book, which is that old things deserve to be treated differently than new things. Things that have lasted deserve to be treated differently than new things.
Sure. We'll get to it later, but just as you're drawing that connection between Hamlet and First Reformed, I wonder, do you find that films hold up in that same way of being worthwhile to return to multiple times? Is there some difference in the number of times or the profit from returning back to them? Just do you have any thoughts on kind of, they're so different, right?
Man, I do. And I, to be honest, I forget now whether this came up in the book or not, but as I said, I'm a big fan of Ethan Hawke.
Yes.
And when I saw Gattaca in 1997, I was 16, and that was a transformative experience. And Gattaca was really the first movie, and I've spoken about this in other interviews and written about this. Gattaca was the first movie that I ever saw where I came out of the theater and I thought, that was amazing, and I have no idea why. And I have nothing to say about it other than to tell other people I saw this amazing movie and you have to see it too. And it was probably like 5 or 6 years later, after I'd seen the movie 5 or 6 times, that I finally began to put together what it was that I loved about this movie, what I thought was so good about it, what good it had done for me. So, I love to stick up for old things, love to argue for old things, but I'm by no means someone who thinks that only old things are good. Gattaca has been a very helpful, like a spiritually helpful movie for me. But it took me a long time to figure out why that was true. I've probably seen Gattaca 20 or 30 or 40 times now.
Wow.
And there's a handful of movies I've seen that many times. And oftentimes it's not until, maybe the 10th or 15th viewing that I am capable of putting into words why I respect the story so much and why I think that it's worth spending all of this time on. So, I've read The Divine Comedy 20 or 30 times, and it is still good after 30 times. But there are certainly modern films made in the last 20 or 30 years by people with social media accounts that are nonetheless very beautiful and worth going back to.
Sure. That idea certainly comes up of returning to movies in Love What Lasts. I will say one of your pieces that's my favorite is Film as Metaphysical Coup, which I think is from
very good.
Forma. Yeah.
That's a deep cut right there. Yeah.
but you reference Gattaca as one, at least for some time. I don't know if this is still the case. I think annually you were watching that film. Is that, you still kind of have that rhythm of film that you're watching every year?
I do. There's still, I would say there's probably 7 or 8 films that I watch on an annual basis. This coming year is going to be the 9th year in a row that I've watched the Grand Budapest Hotel. I only watch that once a year. I watch that on New Year's Day. I always watch Lost in Translation before I take my first road trip over the course of the summer. I generally watch Chris Marker's San Salil before I take a road trip over the course of the summer. I try to watch Remains of the Day every fall. There's a handful of movies I try to watch every fall. Let's see. Yeah, Gattaca's a film. I think it's probably been 2 years since I saw it. I watch The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou on the first Friday of December. I watched that with my wife. Next year will be my 7th year doing that. Fantastic Mr. Fox is every Thanksgiving. Yeah, so I'd say there's probably half a dozen films that I still have like a kind of contractual obligation to watch on certain days of the year.
That's funny. And most of those are actually in this last paragraph too. So it's I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through all of them. That's almost all the movies you list at the very end of that article.
Oh, is it really? Okay.
It really is.
Yeah, that's it. I probably try to watch. I probably watch Die Hard every summer as well. Yeah, there's probably a couple others that I'm gonna kick myself. I'll remember it in a half an hour.
But oh man, but now I want to go down the Die Hard rabbit trail, because I wonder how that fits in with your. I guess let's take all the, like, just as a over the course of Love What Last, you kind of have this like centering idea of bucketing books, film, media, art into these different kind of groupings. Can you talk through those groupings? Maybe, what is the difference between a Jurassic World and a First Reformed when you get down to it?
Right. Well, the book argues that there are 3 categories of all cultural artifacts, and this would include clothing. This is often trends in food, in addition to books and movies and things, which is often what we think of when we think of culture: books, movies, and things. And those 3 categories are the common, the uncommon, and the mediocre. And the book argues that common and uncommon. Common things are things that last a lifetime. They're good things. They're not very good. They're plain good. And upon entering into the cultural imagination or the social imagination, they can be depended upon to last for about 3 generations or 75 years. After which point they begin to lose their value, and they make less and less sense to us beyond the 75-year mark. There are things that last eternally: Paradise Lost, Beowulf, Goldberg Variations, various Requiems, and those are things that are resistant to any kind of corruption at all. They seem to grow. They're created in such a way that the time deepens them as opposed to corrupting them. And then there's mediocre things, and mediocre things are wildly popular in the short term and very unpopular in the long term. Mediocre things are super sensual. They are wildly entertaining. They're very funny. They're very sexy, very slick, very catchy. It's like Transformers movies and Drake and H&M fashion and fried tacos and whatever KFC's putting out this week. And they just appeal in this like overbearing, almost pornographic way to our basest impulses. And I say that without claiming that it's necessarily a sin to eat a chalupa or something like that. But they appeal to the base interests that we have, and we lose interest in them very quickly. So they're here and then they're gone. They're very popular and then they're very not popular. So this is most pop music. I mean, this is most, like, any #1 hit this week is going to be nowhere next week. Like the songs that fill a dance floor in June are going to clear a dance floor in August. This is like Old Town Road by Lil Nas X. This is any Post Malone song. This is anything that everyone thought was amazing 18 months ago that everyone knows is lame today. Kind of fits into the mediocre category. And the book argues that mediocre as a species of art is relatively new. It's maybe 200 years old, and it's sort of this byproduct of the philosophy of the French Revolution.
Can you say more about the so the mediocre thing is appealing to something? Like it is actually appealing in some way. That part is not an illusion. Like there is an enjoyment to, and it's like you talk about how it's kind of an overplayed enjoyment. It's focused on something that like is enjoyable, but it's like kind of amps it up to, it takes it to 11 or whatever.
Right.
I'm wondering, is that a function, do you think, of the intention behind why those pieces of those artifacts are created, or is there something else going on there?
I think that
Why
it's
do
the
these make
very
it?
purpose. Yeah, I think that when they create this kind of like viral hype that surrounds them, they're working according to their purposes.
Yeah.
And so the kind of example that I give in the book of how this has panned out is if you compare like a film, like I think it's so easy to do this with film. Like the book often uses film as an example, even though
Yes.
I wouldn't say that film is the primary subject of the book, but it's just so convenient. That if you look at like a film from the 1950s where a seductive woman wearing a slinky dress enters a scene. I think everyone's seen a movie from the 1950s where a woman wearing a slinky dress appears. And you're like, yeah, my mother wears that to church. Like, that's not all that. What do you think that's really sexy? Oh, weird. Okay. Well, like 75 years ago, everyone was so chaste that the clothing that my mother wears to church would have really turned a guy on. And you could kind of do like a side-by-side comparison of like a quote unquote sexy dress from 55, 65, 75, 85, 95. And that the difference between all of these is pretty basic, that the neckline gets lower and the hem gets higher. Like, and it's not rocket science. And you could take what counted as a exciting movie from the 50s and what counted as an exciting movie from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And the explosions get bigger and the cuts get faster. And it's all very mechanical. Like it's the kind of thing that honestly an AI program could do. And if it strikes me that you could like pump Transformers 2 into an AI program and say, make this more exciting.
Make another one.
And yes. Make this more exciting. And it would essentially turn Transformers 2 into Transformers 3. That it's the kind of adjustment that a computer would make. It's this one-to-one correlation. Like if a skirt's this short, it's this exciting, then a little short is a little more exciting. If an explosion that's this big is exciting, and an explosion that's this much bigger. And this is not the way that brilliance works. So it's not the way that beauty works. Like you can't take Christ carrying the cross by El Greco and be like, make it more pious and turn it up. Like, wow, it's even more pious than before. Whereas you can make a skirt more exciting, you can make an explosion bigger, you can make a film more exciting by amping up the editing. And that there's this kind of materialistic element of excitement, and there's this spiritual element of beauty. And the materialistic element of excitement is like the kind of thing that even a robot could figure out, whereas it really takes a god to figure out how to make something more beautiful, which is why whenever we find something that's actually beautiful, we hold on to it like it's a rare thing, because it is, because gods don't appear in our midst all that often.
Which then leads to a kind of stability across time, right? You talk about how there's like when you look at theological writings for across 1,000 years, the classics can communicate with each other. There's a consistency across them. Whereas with new things, standards change so quickly that there are these upsets every 3-5 years. You're going to lose that over time as you move into the mediocre. I wonder, as a part of this book, or do you have any sense for your example of like the movie from the 1950s we now look at as chaste or traditional, but at the time there must have been people looking at that thinking, this is outlandish. How dare someone dress this way or look this way? I've recently been reading film criticism from John Simon, who I guess was writing from the 70s up through, I think he passed in the 2000s, but had stopped writing by that point. But he was very cranky for a very long time. I just wonder if you have any sense for that of is that just standards have moved over time, that we are offended by different things now than we would have been 50 years ago? Or is there something that was actually good in that 1950s film that should have been seen by the critics of the time also?
Yeah, there's certainly something that moves. There are certain standards that move across time and certain standards that don't. So far as cultural standards are concerned, there's certain things that you can't portray in a film these days without getting a lot of flack for it. So if you look at the Hays Code, the Hays Code prohibits stories that mock the clergy. Like you can't make fun of a man who's a priest or a pastor in a film before 1968. And really you can't not make fun of a pastor or a priest
After
today.
that.
Like that's right. And it's sort of interesting that after you stop making it a rule, the opposite becomes a rule. I do think that there are, and this is going to be like a really small segment of films, and maybe music too. The passage of time does have a kind of chastening effect on things that last. So I've got an article I've got an episode of Proverbial coming out, which is about why I don't let my kids listen to Taylor Swift, but I do let them listen to David Bowie. Even though if you're to do a side-by-side comparison of them in terms of morals and ethics, like one is not vastly superior to the other.
Right.
I do think that there's a kind of chastening effect that occurs over the long haul of time, where things that previously appeared shocking are kind of rendered allowable, and that there is a kind of mystery in the passage of time that has a way of straightening things out that seemed irresolvably crooked. I mean, I think this is why the Lord says to Judas, what you're about to do quickly, like get it over with, that the passage, that the healing effects of time might begin. And so I think that there's a kind of safety in older things that have been vetted by time, things that have been washed by time. And I'm just far more comfortable with my with my children reading and watching and listening to things that are very old and very new. And part of that is because, and this is something I've talked about with Andrew Kern often enough. He brought up going to college in the 1970s and then kind of dropping out and not being aware of popular culture, and then kind of coming back in the 1980s and being amazed that the disco of the 80s had turned into like synth rock or disco of the 70s had turned into synth rock of the 80s. And he commented that like there's really no telling where popular culture is going to go. Like there's not this natural progression. And if your only standard is what's popular, you're just going to go along with wherever everything's going, and there's no telling where it's going to take you. Which is why I don't want my kids listening to Taylor Swift. It's not because, I mean, her music is as amoral as gangster rap. It's all about me and who I am as a person and that sort of thing. But it's also wildly popular now. And if you fall prey to the popular stuff now, you're like surfing on this wave, and you kind of have to go wherever it goes. Whereas if you're just reaching back as far as just 10 to 15 years in the past, you have to make a deliberate choice over what you're doing, which means that you're not going to just go wherever popular culture takes you, which is why I'm just generally more comfortable with my kids listening to anything that's like 25 years old or reading anything that's 25 years old, because I know that they're not reading it because they want to tap into the zeitgeist. Some kind of conscious effort has to be made on their part in order to choose this thing, as opposed to them, just walking out and, raising a finger to the cultural wind and saying, what's popular now? Okay, that's fine. I'll do
listen
whatever
to
that is.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's and especially if it's 20 or 25 years old, it's been passed down at least one generation, right? Even if it's at least, or it's on the cusp of it, I suppose. And so you have that. It's a thing I loved. It's actually lasted at least 20 years, which is not much.
At least 20 years. Right.
Still something.
But it's a higher standard than just what's popular this week.
Sure. Do you have any category for what might be called popularly like a guilty pleasure, or something that you enjoy but you know that you shouldn't, or is that sin? Like, is that just an acknowledgement that I like evil things?
Okay, so I think that there's the term guilty pleasure kind of, in my mind, breaks out into multiple different categories. And then the term is often used in a very loose sort of way. So an example might be, like, say someone knows what good things are. Say someone knows that, you're not going to do a whole lot better than Mozart's Requiem or the Goldberg Variations. Say somebody knows that Josquin de Prez is about as good as religious music gets. Say somebody knows that, the Anglicans kind of triumphed with their understanding of Christmas, and that the aesthetics of the Anglican Christmas is about as high as things get. And then at the end of all of that, they're like, but I still have this thing for the song Save Tonight by Eagle Eye Cherry from 1998. I don't, the person who knows that Goldberg Variations and Mozart's Requiem are about as good as it gets, I think that they have to feel guilty about something like Save Tonight, because I think Save Tonight's a great song. And I think the fact that Save Tonight's not going to last 300 years doesn't mean that it's not good for what it is. I think Save Tonight's a brilliant song. I think it's one of the more pious pop songs of the last 50 years. I'd put it up there with Wouldn't It Be Nice by the Beach Boys. I'd put it up there with Keep Your Hands to Yourself by the Georgia Satellites. It's just this pious pop song. And so maybe the person who has these very high tastes feels a little chagrined to admit an affinity for a lower thing. But you got to get over that. You got to acknowledge that common things have a worth. And that a little respect for the masters of the present genre is not unworthily placed or unworthily given. Even Edmund Burke says that somewhere in Reflections on the Revolution of France. It's like, you got to give credit to people that figure out the popular style and master it. Like, there's nothing wrong with giving a little respect for people that figure out the trend of the week and they kind of own it. And so, if somebody who appreciates good things is like, you gotta hand it to Michael Jackson, man, he figured it out. He had something down that nobody else did. I don't think you have to feel guilty about it. Right. But that's, I don't think that's the guilty pleasure the way that the term's often used. I think that the term guilty pleasure means like, because I'm so aware I've earned the right to like really wretched things. And that's often what it means. And so as long as we're making this distinction between the guilty pleasure, where you're acknowledging that like Eagle Eye Cherry's Save Tonight is a great song, but that like something seemed like allowable guilty pleasures, maybe that's a paradoxical term, or that you really don't need to feel guilty about them, whereas others do. I mean, if you're there's some lines in Line Across. If Game of Thrones is your guilty pleasure, you should feel guilty about that. Like, that's not cool. I'm not going that far. You should feel bad. If Game of Thrones is your guilty pleasure, you should feel bad about that. So I do think there's a point where something is like so disgusting and wretched and servile and profane that you don't get to draw a circle around it and claim that your understanding of theology makes it okay for you to indulge in this wretched thing. But I think that guilty pleasure is kind of this vague term that's too often applied to too many things. And I'm unwilling to say that Game of Thrones is a guilty pleasure is the same usage of the term as guilty pleasure for like a great pop song from 25 years ago that has something credible to offer, even though it's not Bach.
Can you say more of what makes Game of Thrones, what kind of sets it in that category where it's kind of beyond the pale? In the book you talk about, there's art that we might call moral, but it's still trash, right? It's bright colors, it's loud music, it degrades the soul, but at the end everyone's friends with each other, and like that would not be a good use of one's time. Whereas something like Game of Thrones perhaps is more artfully made, but is it the message of it? Is it what you're seeing on the screen itself? What's different about that?
I think that a big part of it is what you're seeing on the screen itself, and I do think that counts. I would classify myself as someone who is, honestly, this is probably going to rub a lot of people wrong way. I feel the same way about censorship that most people feel about free speech. Like I'll put myself down as the Burkean conservative that likes the idea of censorship, and the idea of like a council that reviews stuff and says, no, that's too gross, we're not doing that. I like that idea. Like I like the Hays Code. I like this group of like fuddy-duddy old people that watches movies and says, the hemline is too low. You've got to, like, I like that. Like I would be okay if the censorship board was just a randomly selected group of people that were over the age of 75. Like I wouldn't vet them any other way.
Right.
But like, while I say that, I'm by no means dismissing every piece of art that wouldn't pass the Hays Code. So I think that there are films that could and would have been made during the Hays Code, and would have been made slightly differently. I think Children of Men, I think Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men,
incredible,
could and would have been made during before '68 when the Hays Code ended. I'm still going to watch it. It's a rated R movie. It deserves to be rated R. I think it's the most pious film of the last 25 years, but it's still rated R. So I don't want to make like this kind of one-to-one correlation between like, oh, no one should watch rated R movies because no one should hear these words and see the human body being torn apart in visceral ways. At the same time, I do think the world would be better off that way. So I do think it would be better off if there was a more exacting code for the government of popular culture. So when it comes to something like Game of Thrones, I think the Game of Thrones is the reason why that one's off the table. I think for Christians is because it's become a byword for perversion. Like everyone knows that the deal with Game of Thrones is that it's nastier and more brutal and more perverse than all of the TV shows, and HBO made they made a lot of money off of creating shows that were nastier than anyone else was willing to pay. And so for a Christian to engage in something like that and be like, well, it's great storytelling and so forth. I don't think that the world is so bereft of great storytelling that you got to expose yourself to that sort of thing just to get your good storytelling fix. At the same time, I don't think a ratings code should have ultimate authority. So, I mean, this is kind of one of those classic examples where most Christians kind of throw in the towel simply because it's hard to say what's allowable and what's not. Like modern people love to be like, well, it's hard to say, and so they don't even try.
So therefore, I can watch whatever I want to. Right?
Yeah, it's hard to say what's allowable and what's not. Therefore, I can watch whatever. That's exactly right. Or like it's hard to tell what's modest and what's not, which means that there's no such thing as modesty. No. The fact that it's, I'll agree, it's hard to tell what's modest. It's really hard to create an objective standard and be like, that dress is modest, that's not. Those shoes are modest, those shoes are not. But my goodness, like, man up. The fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that it can't be done. It doesn't mean you have to throw in the towel and be like, no one will ever figure out what modest means because it's a little hard to tell. I mean, I would be willing to say it's hard to. There can be points where it's hard to tell what the difference between a masculine thing and a feminine thing is. Don't quit trying, though. It's very necessary that we keep trying. And the fact that there's a point where the boundaries blur doesn't mean that the boundaries are always hard to tell apart, or the fact that it's a little hard to tell apart at certain points means that we throw in the towel and we give up completely.
In the book, you talk about essentially turning to other people, letting other people have that input into the films that you're watching, the music you're listening to, the books that you're reading. So, one way to take that is what you're talking about is someone actually in official power that can dictate what is and isn't on screen. The other is to have people you trust. Right. I guess I'm curious how you find those people, or is that literally you have your close friends and you trust their taste, or are there magazines you're reading? Like, how do you even think about knowing what to consume?
Man, I would start with friends. I would start with friends that you trust. And I would say that everyone ought to identify like 4 or 5 friends that you have. Where if there are certain people in my life where if I have a friend who says, you've got to see this movie, like I'm going to see it, not because the movie looks good, but because that's my friend and I've known him for 20 years and I trust this person. Like we have compatible tastes and he's given me great recommendations before. And even if I don't love the movie, whenever I'm done watching it, we can discuss it and it'll be for some greater purpose. And the same thing is true of records, or books. So I would say that you ought to first go by your friends, because one of the great purposes, not the great purpose. This is not the great purpose of popular culture, but one of the great purposes of popular culture is giving people things to talk about in common. And I know that seems very basic. That seems like the low-hanging fruit. That seems like the easiest kind of argument, and it's an argument that's often been overused, I think. So I want to kind of make that claim with a grain of salt.
Sure.
But one of the great things about popular culture is that it gives us things to talk about with other people. And I'm no great lover of sports, but I think that one of the great things about sports is that it's a good thing to talk about with people. Kind of like Andy Dillard says that the weather is always worth talking about. The weather is sports for people who don't follow sports.
Sure.
That's why the weather is a great thing to talk. Weather's just like sports. Weather is sports for women. But merely having a thing to talk about, I think, is worthwhile. If it's not going to cost you a lot of time or money or effort, and if it has some kind of general purpose of good, and I think that sports kind of fit that those qualifications. Weather definitely does. Certain films and books. So I would say that starting with recommendations from your friends, merely because it's good to have. I've had great conversations about bad movies. I've had great conversations with friends about movies that were terrible, and it was almost like Job's friends questioning Job, where like a bad theology of his friends brings up the brilliant theology of Job. And I've watched terrible movies and like ripped them apart with friends, and it's turned into something wonderful where we had a realization about what makes for a great story simply because we saw a terrible story together. Obviously that can be taken too far, but so I would say go with friends first, but then in this day and age, I would say that by the age of, by the time you're 35 or 40, if you have a laptop and use the internet, that you should have a few media outlets that you kind of trust, that there should be a few critics that you take seriously. And there's a handful of critics that I take seriously. If Anthony Lane recommends something highly, I'd see anything that Anthony Lane recommended. I would see just I would see anything that Sofia Coppola recommended. I would see anything. I don't know, anything that Otessa Moshfegh took seriously, I would take seriously. So I think that there's also like contemporary artists that you take seriously, and if a favorite writer or musician of yours is like, you should check out this record, that makes sense. Far more sense than just being like, well, what's popular this week? Okay, I guess I'll check it out.
Sure. Just because you brought that up of the many years ago, you used an example that the quality of a movie is essentially, will you get more in conversation out of the film than the length of the film?
Right.
I don't think that comes up here, but I think that it's a good heuristic. It's a good rule of thumb to say, am I going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about Transformers for more than the 2.5 hour runtime, right? Like there's no way I could do that.
Right.
But I guess just on that side of on talking about bad films and still coming to something true or interesting, do you have any interest? I feel like there's been this like proliferation of podcasts and videos that are essentially making fun of those bad movies. Is that kind of like the other side of the coin of what you're getting at? Like you're focused on the let's see the good thing. Is there value then in the laughing at bad things also, or do you see that kind of, or are there problems there, or is it something that you even think about?
Yeah, I think that there's here's what I'd say about that. I think that when an example of that comes up that genuinely requires it, that it's an unusual kind of instance, and you know it and you can spot it from a mile off. So if I mean, here's an example. If it's 2009 and all your students are going to see Twilight this weekend,
right,
and you want to go see it, knock yourself out. That's fine. And if when you buy the ticket, you're like, this is going to be garbage. Sure. I think that there's a lot of people that are trying to build careers out of that.
Yes.
And I think that's dumb. I think it's dumb to build a career out of ripping bad things apart. I think that you lose a sense of true north if
Sure.
you try that. And it very quickly your standards get skewed in ways that you couldn't possibly predict. And that you also kind of overvalue your own intellect in the end, that you think of yourself as being more clever.
Yeah.
And you develop this habit of going into things to tear them apart. It lowers your standards. I mean, it's bad for any number of reasons. But like if every 3 years a teacher wants to see something wildly popular just because all your students have seen it, and you know exactly what you're getting into. If every male student in your high school is seeing Deadpool 2 this weekend,
right,
and you're like, I'm gonna go see this. Okay. But if it becomes this kind of excuse where you're like, I gotta stay in touch with culture.
right.
And so I'm gonna see every popular thing that comes out, and I'm gonna pretend that I'm above it every single time. I
Right.
think that's delusional. I think that you don't understand what spirit you're of if you're giving over all of your time to this stupidity and claiming that it's not actually going to affect you and that you're not being shaped by it. I mean, I've been deeply shaped. This is I think a claim that's addressed in the book. I've been deeply shaped by things that I claimed I was beyond at the time that I saw them.
Right.
I have gone into things. I've gone into movies, gone into records, where at the time I was convinced that my superior education was going to keep me aloof from this thing and at this kind of objective distance, and ended up getting those things just wrapped around the axle of my mind and never really letting go. So this is a special temptation to people in the classical Christian world who are like, well, I've read Aristotle's Rhetoric, therefore I can watch Deadpool 2 and it's not going to have an effect on me. You're naive. Right. Like that's not how it works. People with subtle minds are even more affected by that stuff.
Yes.
This is Beatrice's whole dressing down of Dante when he reaches the top of Mount Purgatory.
Yeah.
When she's like, yeah, the people that have well-formed minds, the weeds grow even like more prolifically in good soil than bad soil. And so if you've got a good education and you've read Aristotle and Cicero and Augustine, and you're feeding that mind garbage, the garbage is not being sifted through. Those are seeds that are going into your brain that are going to grow out even more tenaciously than if you're some scrub that had to read, Jurassic Park in 9th grade, and you don't really know how to think and you don't really know how to feel. If you didn't get an education, you're probably safer watching Deadpool than somebody who did get an education. You did get an education, something like that could wreck you. In the same way that, like, somebody who's tummy and out of shape can eat a burger and nothing's going to happen to them. Whereas if you're like an Olympic quality athlete and you eat a burger, you're going to get wasted for days. Like, you're not going to be good for time trials or nothing. So like the more finely tuned and excellent the thing is, the worse it responds to bad stimuli. It's not like you've created some kind of like super hyper powered machine that like churns through anything less than goodness.
Right.
It's actually affecting you on a more subtle level than you recognize.
Which I think you bring up in the book in the context of worldview analysis, that
Yes,
essentially
that's right.
is like, the purpose of worldview analysis is to allow the person taught to essentially consume anything, right? Any movie
Right.
that's put in front of them can become either it's exposed for the lie that it is, or we find the good piece of it and we kind of consume that, move on to the next thing, and just
That's
grind
right.
through everything that we go through. But um, you talk about that being like an insufficient way of approaching art, an insufficient way. Again, I'm focused more on film here. You acknowledged this
Yeah.
before. The book is not only about film. It's just an easy
Right.
example to point to for a lot of these things.
Right.
Can you just say more about that? Just like
Yeah.
what are the problems of worldview analysis? Why is that not a good way to approach things?
So, well, it's not, I wouldn't say that worldview
Ah,
analysis is a bad way to approach things. I think it is insufficient in and of itself to account for the length and breadth of all the cultural artifacts that you're going to have to deal with. Um, so, uh, so culture, worldview analysis is going to be enough to tell you. Worldview analysis ought to be enough to tell you, after listening to like 20 seconds of a Drake song, this is nihilistic garbage.
right.
So, in that sense, I'm willing to give like 2.5 cheers for worldview analysis. Worldview analysis can absolutely crunch through the onslaught of popular culture that's not really worth a second look or second thought. You when the latest Cardi B song comes on, worldview analysis is going to let you know that you shouldn't listen to that, and it's going to let you know that it's a waste of time, like 10 seconds
Right.
in. But at the same time, that worldview analysis is great for sorting out, like making this kind of easy judgment between this might be worth my time versus this is obviously not worth my time. Worldview analysis is not sufficient for sorting out the divine comedy.
Hmm.
So not every cultural artifact deserves the same level of attention. And this is the first 2 chapters of the book. I realized this. And I realized this when I started teaching classic literature, that that books like Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy are very different and require something different than Jurassic Park. And a simple, kind of simple criteria could be applied to Jurassic Park. And you can figure out whether it's worth your time, or whether it's just totally, totally wrong, totally fallacious, or whether it might be worth, giving a few minutes more to. But that's not a kind of judgment that you're making with Paradise Lost.
Right.
Like very few people are deciding whether a work in popular culture is the sort of thing that they ought to open up their soul to in the same way that you open up your soul to something like Paradise Lost. So even something like even a work of popular culture that I respect, Gattaca, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, I'm still not treating these things the way that I treat Paradise Lost.
Sure.
Paradise Lost has lasted for 400 years. It's been handed down, by 16 generations of people. It's been translated into every language. Paradise Lost is a book that my people, it's a book that Western societies,
right.
It's a book that mankind gave to me. That's not how Gattaca came to me. Sure. And so, when my entire culture says Paradise Lost is worth your time, and as Stephen Turley says in one of his early lectures on truth, beauty, and goodness, true, good, and beautiful things made us. We didn't make them. Paradise Lost is a book that made me. I didn't make it. Yeah. Whereas Gattaca is like still one of those things that's my culture produced, and so it's this more symbiotic kind of relationship. I'm a part of the world that created this movie. This movie is kind of responding to the world that I had a hand in creating. It's not going to last forever. It's good now. It's not going to be good forever. Whereas Paradise Lost deserves a higher level of respect. Right. And I think this accords with Scripture, because Scripture teaches us to think in terms of respect, in terms of proportionality. Like when the elder who governs well is described as being worthy of double honor, I assume that it's double the portion that parents are worthy of, that honor your parents, double portion for elders who govern well. Yeah. And that there's, in the temple, there's a holy place, but there's a most holy place. When Jesus is asked what commandment's most important, he's not like, well, they're all important, duh. He's like, picks the 2 that are most important. And so this, like a scale of glory angels, archangels, cherubim, seraphim. Like all of heaven is arranged in this kind of ascendant hierarchy of glory. All the things on earth exist in this hierarchy of glory. And something like Paradise Lost or Mozart's Requiem sit pretty close in terms of earthly cultural artifacts. They sit pretty close to the top of that. Or something like Gattaca, I mean, it's low. It's worthy of some kind of respect, but it's not the kind of respect that these ancient things deserve. Certainly not the kind of glory that Virgil has or that Homer has or something. And so I think that the cultural analysis is capable of sorting out the lowest level of glory there is. But the worldview analysis is not capable of sorting out these higher realms of glory, these things that formed us, that have authority over us. Whereas it's really how about this? Worldview analysis is an effective tool, but it's got a very narrow range of effective usage, I guess I would say.
Because I think it presents itself as kind of an all-encompassing, again, we're going to teach you how to handle everything you're going to experience from here on out, and it's probably not sufficient for that. But
absolutely, I think you're totally right.
I think it's fair. I guess just going with that, I mean, you are someone who is putting out, you record, I think Proverbial is every 2 weeks. You have the Cedar Room with Cersei. Is this your fourth book now? You've had How to Be Unlucky, Something We Will Not Forget, Love What Lasts, Blasphemers.
25th.
Yeah, your book of essays on
25th.
Christmas. Yeah.
And this is 5th. Yeah.
But I'm curious, just in your discussion of glory there and of like kind of things potentially entering into the canon, how do you understand your work in light of that?
I'm not gonna
like is that what you're
That's a great
for?
question. It's a great question. No, it's not gonna, it doesn't have the ambition to enter. Well, I mean, I'm gonna say this, and God, I hope this could sound hopelessly arrogant, but no individual person gets to decide what's in the canon and what's not.
Sure.
So if no individual gets to decide what's in the canon, I think that some individuals have had a sense that they were working on something special. Dante certainly had a sense that he was working on something special. Milton also had a sense that he was working on something special. I'd be pretty surprised if someone like Jane Austen knew that her work was going to survive 200 years. So I think that most of my work is dated in such a way that it's probably got a 25-year lifespan. The best of it, the best that I'm able to do, I'm not going to beat 3 generations. I'd be happy with 1 generation. I'd be happy with still in print 25 years from now. I mean, at the same time, it's impossible to say what's going to last. And I made this argument. I think I made this argument in the book. But the great classical heresy is claiming that something's going to last before it lasts. There's no such thing as instant classic. Anytime I encounter somebody in classical education that uses the term instant classic, I'm like, I'm revoking your classical card. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about.
Sure.
You're an imposter. If you think there's such a thing as instant classic, like instant heirloom, like if somebody ever referred to an instant heirloom, God, it's passed down for 9 generations. I just bought it today. You're crazy. You don't know what time is. You can't count. You need to use your fingers more. But no one knows what's going to last. I got a pretty good sense that nothing I've written is going to last more than 25 years. And so, I mean, like if it ever came down to it and someone was like, well, should I read How to Be Unlucky or should I read Consolation of Philosophy? Right. Consolation of Philosophy, obviously.
But thankfully it's a short book, so you have time to come back to How to Be Unlucky. I see what you did there. So. Yeah.
But I think that the books that I've produced are a part of. How about this? I would hope that the books that I've written are a part of the small selection of people's time that's committed to new things. And if I met somebody at a conference that was like, your books sound really interesting, but I got too many old books to read, I wouldn't take that as an insult.
Yeah.
I'd be like,
yeah. Okay.
Look, man, to be honest, like there's a lot, like I write books that fit into a genre that I don't read a lot of myself. So like I'm not reading a lot of books that are like How to Be Unlucky. I'm not reading a lot of books that are like Love What Laughs. It takes a pretty special book in that in that genre for me to be like, all right, I guess I'll read it. And I think Carl Truman's book Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self was kind of the last book that came out, maybe one of the only books in the last 5 years that kind of fit into that little bit of history, little bit of cultural critique, little bit of that I read. And I really enjoyed that. It was a very worthwhile book. I was very, very glad to read that. But that's making up a pretty small part of my reading list. And I imagine that the books that I write are probably making up, the kind of minority report in most people's reading habits.
I just ask it because you have such a high regard for the classics. Even in your answer, you're making reference to these other great books that are to be read. But your response to that is not, therefore I shouldn't write, therefore I shouldn't produce. It's you're still pointing people to those things. And maybe there's not a question there. I just wonder, like, is that something you've thought about before? Of like, you want to point people to these great works, but you are still producing work yourself. It doesn't sound like that bothers you. Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. I'll say that it comes up more often as a criteria for whether I hit the publish button on something that I've written for Cersei. Sure. So, I mean, there's hundreds of articles out there that I've written and been ready to post, and I was like, man, this just isn't worth anybody's time. I don't want to waste anybody's time with this. And it's like I look back over the article and I'm like, well, I mean, like the argument here is true. I think it's sound, but man, who cares? Like this just isn't important. Nobody needs to read this. And so I've had ideas for books that I've scrapped as well. I've written a few chapters in books that I've scrapped. I would say, I think at best, my work is a way of giving thanks for the canon. That everyone needs a way of giving thanks for the good things that have formed them, and so when I think about the works of art that I really love, like modern works of art that I really love, a lot of them seem kind of born out of gratitude for these even older things that have lasted. And I think that that's one of the value of new things, that new things can show us how to give thanks for old things,
right?
In creative and productive ways. So I mean, some of my favorite films, some of my favorite modern books, I would say are giving thanks for ways. The books themselves are ways of giving thanks for older things. Cormac McCarthy's The Road is really a way of giving thanks for the Odyssey. Obviously, Till We Have Faces, a way of giving thanks for the myth of Psyche. And that the creative way of giving thanks is a legitimate way of giving thanks, and it helps inform people on. It helps inform readers on what it means to really be grateful that something exists. To be really grateful is to shape your life around it, not merely to acknowledge from a distance, that was good, but to actually live differently, to behave differently, to act differently. And I think that some of that living and behaving and acting is carried out in writing new music and writing new books, painting new paintings.
I think also just your role as a teacher, that think of how many words are used in lesson plans or in writing up the messages that will be given in the classroom that won't last beyond that teacher, but are still so impactful to the people that will receive that. So I think there's that side of it too, where like for there to be you talk about this in the book, for there to be a next generation that is celebrating the works of Homer, they have to be taught about Homer. For someone to appreciate Boethius, they need to have read the Consolation. So that's right. That's like a necessary part, even if, and that's what, that's the reason we talk about old things too, is like, if we're going to point people to something, we'd rather it be that, because like our podcast isn't going to last very long, but the
Right.
works we talk about hopefully will. Except
Right.
I think we did an episode on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, so maybe that one won't last, but hopefully the rest of them do. You probably thought my question was going this direction. I did want to ask you, how do you write so much? Like, what is your, do you have like are you writing hours every day? I think at some point you said these came out of conversations with friends of yours. Just how, where, how do you do this?
So I would say, there's a different impetus behind the books than there is behind anything else. So, the podcasts, oh God, I would say podcasts and articles. I write when I'm upset. I write when
I've wondered for a while.
Yeah,
I've wondered for a while if people are
angry.
terrified to talk to you. Like you'll be walking, like you'll have some kind of debate around Veritas,
right.
and then you'll go home and like, bang out a 1,000-word article or something.
Don't say that too loudly. That's probably the case. So I feel like I kind of pay for that, because it's very easy to gossip about people that I'm too intimidated to talk to personally. And there's lots of rumors and lots of nasty things that are said about me behind my back because I'm too intimidated to talk to them personally. But yeah, there's times where I kind of relish the role of like the Charles Barkley of classical Christian education. But it's
incredible.
Yeah, those you can't feel fear and feel anger at the same time. Anger casts out fear. And I'm oftentimes when I sit down to write, I feel like the best things that I've written are written out of a kind of fearless frame of mind, because I'm frustrated by what I see. And that's there's all these, I swear, there's all these articles that I want to write that are nothing like what I do write. Like the articles that I really want to write are these very, very basic kind of reflections on. I've had this article on the song I think is the best pop song written in the last 25 years. Thomas, I've been sitting on this.
What's the song?
I gotta save it.
Okay,
sorry. I gotta save this for the article.
Yeah.
I've been sitting on this idea for this article for 3 years. And,
oh my gosh.
Because it's not, it's not pressing. Like there's nothing driving me to write this. And so I've sat down to begin writing it a few times. And it just doesn't seem all that important. So almost everything that I write that I actually get to hit the publish button on seems important. And when something seems important, you like make time for it. Like, like the article I put up yesterday on Cersei about high school athletes getting away with murder because we don't want to punish the team.
Right.
I mean, you can guess where that came from, right? I mean, like there's no surprises here. And I should say that like the articles that I write are not all about my school. I think people have this misconception sometimes. Like given who I am and the way that I represent myself, like people like write me and tell me ridiculous stories all the time. So after you present yourself to the public the way that I do, like the number of people who write me and they're like, you won't believe what's going on in my school. And I'm like, yeah, I totally believe that. So I work at a very good school. I wouldn't think that like all the things that I write are a reflection of problems at my school. Like I collect these stories. I spent many hours like looking at classical Christian websites and considering the way that classical Christian schools represent themselves, and scouring blogs and just seeing what the movement actually is and where it stands and all that. So I would hope no one would be under some kind of delusional belief that like all of my articles have been ripped from the headlines of Veritas or Richmond, Virginia. That's absolutely not the case. But when you're frustrated, you find time to write. Like if you got something important to say, you find time to write. Whereas that's not really the books. The books that I write are always very different because they're not born out of anything pressing. Like if you're going to write a book, you're committing yourself to like an 18-month process. So
Right.
you can't think of it as being super important in the same way.
Hmm.
It's something that you write an article or do a podcast on is important. You know, it's important to feed your kids tonight. It's important to have an inheritance for your grandkids. And the way that we work out these various important things is very different. One of them is going to require daily effort. The other is going to have like, you're going to commit yourself to it when you've got time and when it occurs to you. And I say that that's more like what a book is, that the books are written the way that you think of like, I want to give my grandchildren an inheritance. And so they're kind of born more slowly that way.
That's yeah. It's just interesting to because you wrote articles for much longer than you've been writing books, correct? Haven't
Right.
Yeah. Was that
in November it'll be 10 years for Cersei.
And did you eventually get to a point where you realized that you had something that you felt that way, that, you know, your relationship with Boethius was something that needed to be put into a book? It wasn't served by the format of the article. Like, is that kind of where that comes out of then?
Yeah, you eventually realize, eventually the idea gets bigger than an article, and that might be it. That you write the 1,200 word article, and when you look at it in the end, you're like, it just doesn't do a whole lot in and of itself. So I mean, somebody would be within their rights to notice that like the chapter length in How to Be Unlucky very short compared to Love What Lasts.
Yes.
Like the length of my chapters has stretched
longer
out over time.
Yep.
And that's really because when I wrote How to Be Unlucky, I was nothing other than a blogger. And so, you know, there's a lot of chapters in that book that are, honestly, there's a lot of chapters in How to Be Unlucky that sit in the blog article length.
Sure.
Whereas none of the chapters in Love What Lasts are that way. Like Love What Lasts is a kind of a fully formed book. It's the most bookish book that I've written. It feels more like a book. There's lots of footnotes and citations. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like, well, you know, I'm 41 now. I guess I better write something that looks and feels like a book.
Well, I guess just to roll with that, then you mentioned that you have another book coming out later this year, or that you'll finish later this year. What's that?
That book is done,
Amazing.
and it'll go to editors and layout here in just a couple of weeks, and that is a collection of dialogues with students.
Interesting.
So I've written a number of dialogues over the years for Cersei.
Your articles, yeah.
Yes, and these are all dialogues with students. Like Love What Lasts. These are composites. So these are conversations that I feel like every adult has with, like, whether you're a parent or whether you're a teacher. These are like perennial conversations that adults have with teenagers. Sure. Especially that Christian adults have with Christian teenagers. So there's a conversation about dating. There's a conversation about R-rated movies. There's a conversation about dress. There's a conversation about like if you work in a high school, if you're surrounded by 16-year-olds, you're just going to have these conversations over and over and over again. Some of them are a little more timely. There's a conversation about optimism. What is optimism? But then there's just more basic ones like, should I date a non-Christian? Is that okay? So none of the conversations in the book are about like Virgil, but they are all conversations that I've had with Christian students over the years. Yep. And the point of the book, like other books, I imagine this as a book that would be helpful for 16-year-olds to read, but I think it would be helpful for adults to read as well, as a kind of instruction manual on how to talk to 16-year-olds. So I do believe that most adults are entirely too sentimental when they're talking with teenagers, and that the primary goal in talking with teenagers is not to give them the truth, but to give them something that makes them feel better, or merely some kind of strategy for dealing with a problem, or a new interpretive lens for seeing things. And I think that giving people the truth is a little bit different than that. So I've tried to make all the conversations as untheoretical and as common sense as possible. This is a book that be great for a youth group to read if you're unfortunate enough to have to go to that. It would be great for Sunday school. It'd be great for, but it'd be great for teachers as well. So that teachers, the goal is to help teachers talk to teenagers in a way that teenagers can trust.
Yes.
And there's a handful of conversations I had with adults back when I was a teenager that had this kind of long, lingering effect on me. And many of the best of those conversations were conversations where adults just spoke to me from the adult realm of truth and didn't try to sugarcoat anything. And I've been very grateful for those conversations. And so I wanted to try to present the way that I talk to students. I'm not sure if Circe's actually going forward with this, but the book is very brusque. I think it's actually coming with a disclaimer. I could be wrong on that. I think there may be like a trigger warning in the front of the book that.
What was the? I'm sure it's been months at this point, but what was the article they put out of like why we published Josh Gibbs or something? Like I did not expect that your water bottle article would get this amount of blowback.
Yeah, that one was, man, the water bottle article. Yeah, the water bottle article, and then articles about personality tests have always ruffled feathers. Really, like a lot of the articles, and I should always put this in perspective, like the article that I wrote on water bottles was probably like the most well-received thing that I wrote that year.
Yeah.
And 9 people got angry.
Oh, really? Okay, good.
Yeah,
in my mind, it was like tons of people, but I guess it was only a few.
I mean, it's far fewer than you think.
Of course, sure.
I mean, like the article was about banning water bottles from in-class usage, which my school did this year, banned water bottles from in-class usage. And I mean, there's certainly this small contingent of parents that are like, my child's basically gonna die because they cannot have their IV drip of water constantly.
Right.
But I made this is a comment that I made in How to Be Unlucky. Man, people receive negative feedback so much, they take it so much more to heart than positive feedback. If you've got a stadium full of people cheering your name and this one guy with his middle finger up in the back, you're gonna be like, what did I do? What did I do? And you're gonna like find that guy and be like, what are you so upset about? Like, it's not enough to be, to receive praise from all of these other people. So the water bottle article was liked by a lot of people and really despised by 9 people.
A very small number, yeah.
A very small number comparatively. But I did find it telling how many teachers were like, yes, I hate those things. You're so right. That was immensely gratifying. When the announcement was made at Veritas that we were allowed to ban water bottles, there was like a Bronx cheer that went up.
Oh, really?
Wow. Everyone was like, all of the faculty was just delighted. Like it felt like,
I think you've said that
Star had just blown up.
Haven't you said that like all your positive feedback is from teachers, people who are actually in the classroom?
Yeah.
Then all the questions are from people who aren't, right? So
yes, it's general. That's a general characterization. Every now and then, there's a teacher. Oh, I mean, the other article like this was the article I wrote about like rich people that go on vacation in September.
Mm-hmm. And missing school days, right? Was it that one?
Yeah, like yes, like these families that are like 2 weeks into the school year, are like, I'm leaving for a week to go to the Bahamas, and when I get back, I'm going to need you to tutor me during lunchtime and after school for all the stuff that I miss. And you're like,
No.
Why would I want to do that? That's
Right.
ridiculous. Are you going to pay me for my time? Like, you are aware that there is a 10-week break over the course of the summer where you're supposed to do that. Did you just want to get a good deal on a rental in the Bahamas, and that's why you waited until my time rolled around?
Yeah.
And there was a couple of people that there was some pearl clutching over that article. There were some rich people from the Bahamas that did
Right.
not appreciate that article. But I mean, like, most of the feedback I got was like, finally somebody said it.
Finally. Right.
Right. Which is I mean, I gotta say, that's the one word that I'm always gunning for in anything that I write, is for people to be like, finally.
Finally,
I feel
someone
like
said it.
finally someone said it. I think that's the highest praise.
Sure.
Finally.
Well, I realize that we're over time, and I still have all I want to do is keep asking about this. I guess I'll have to. Hopefully, we can have you back on when the book of dialogues comes out.
Yeah, sure.
I know you're at your conference last year. Your sections on student ministry or kind of student life, I found really compelling, and it sounds like you're going to be getting it at some of those conversations with that book. So I'm excited for that. Do you have a name for the book?
I have a tentative. Man, I'm really itchy about this because the tentative title is divisive. And maybe you can get some feedback on your show. People can. The tentative title of this book is A Parlay with Youth.
Okay.
Which some people hear and they're like, that's awful. Why would you go with that? What's the word parlay mean? And then other people think that it's catchy. So that's a tentative title right now. A Parlay with Youth.
I will say, have you come up with all the titles for your books? Because you somehow they are all very catchy.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All the titles thus far have been devised over the dinner table while talking with my family.
It's incredible.
All of them have come up. And a lot of the original titles were really terrible. And then in talking about what the title ought to be with my wife and my daughters over dinner, something comes up and someone, not always me, is like, that's the title. That's what you should.
Yeah, I can't imagine the conversation where "Love What Last" came up, but I like a parlay with youth. I feel like you get that kind of.
You think it works?
Well, yeah. The part of it kind of gets that parlay is like I don't know the right way to phrase this, but like that it's like an older word. Like you're kind of getting that piece of it where it's like kind of a heavier conversation with more weight to it, and you're very clear of who you're talking to. So I don't know.
Yes, and when I think of parlay, I think both of gambling. And I think of what the first thing that comes to mind when I think of parlay is like the scene in the movie where the two generals on opposing sides of a battle like meet in the middle and they're like, you should surrender. No, we'll never. And that's the parlay in the middle. And so because parlay like both connotes these kind of like high and low images are connoted by the term parlay. I kind of liked it as a description of conversations with students. So
it's probably what a lot of those conversations feel like too, right? That they're between like two warring factions, right?
Yeah. I mean, they often, there's students often come to the conversation that way.
Yeah.
But it's a bit of a false front, and they want. Like big conversations with students are almost never what they appear to be at first blush. There's always this deeper thing going on. And so like if a female student comes to me and she opens a conversation with something like, I'm dating this non-Christian guy, but it's really okay. I know what you're thinking. No one starts that conversation in earnest, right? They have all of these things going on. And they want to be convinced. They want to see if you're convinced. They're trying to convince themselves, and so that's often the attitude that I took when I was dealing with older people. Like often, I think teenagers are testing for weakness. I think the smartest teenagers come to adults testing for weakness.
Yeah.
And they want to believe that adults are smarter. They want to believe that experience counts for something. They know that they don't have any experience. They're desperate for somebody who has experience to confirm what they think about the world. And so they come and they're almost never presenting a straightforward argument. They almost always have like multiple goals that they're working on whenever they're talking. And I find those conversations really fascinating. Like when you sit down and you talk with someone about some moral issue, and you know that they've got these conversations with their friends, they've got going, they've got conversations with parents. You know that you're not the first teacher that they've asked about this. You know that there's like other adults that are bouncing what you're saying off. I love those conversations because I remember doing that when I was a kid. You know, I remember like trying to figure out where adults disagreed with each other, where my teachers disagreed with each other, and I was always fascinated whenever I could get my teachers to disagree with each other. It was like, you know, it was like finally something's on the line, something counts, something really matters.
Right. And some part of it also has to be the student wanting to see if the teacher really believes the things that they talk about. Like,
Right.
Like they know that they're doing something wrong, but will the teacher kind of give in and just like, oh, do whatever you want to, because that thing I've talked
Right.
about doesn't actually matter. And maybe that's the testing for weakness you're talking about, but just like, how serious are they about this thing that they talk about in abstract, but when it's actually me
Right.
that they're talking to, are they going to like tell me the truth?
Right. Are they going to sound the same, look the same?
Yeah.
When it's one-on-one as when they're
as when it's a group or
the classroom. Yeah.
I'm excited for that. That's you know, I said it at the beginning. I just want to say again, really enjoyed Love What Lasts. It's a great book.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
still your output is again that you're doing. You still have the podcast. You still have Cedar Room. You still have your conference. We should talk. You have your summer conference is coming up. I think in just a few weeks at this point.
Yep.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit before we?
Sure. Yeah, it's a little over 2 weeks. So June 23rd, 24th, Gibbs Classical Online Conference, second annual. All the lectures are on very practical classroom matters. Almost all of the titles of the lectures are how to teach this, how to teach that, how to teach various classical works, tips for teaching history, tips, tips for teaching rhetoric, how to teach political philosophy, ideas on how to test on all these things, approaches to commonly taught books like Pride and Prejudice, Paradise Lost, Divine Comedy, Frankenstein, how to present these books, how to what kind of themes are best to highlight when you're talking to 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds about these books. The goal of the conference is to be as practical as possible. As with the first conference, my goal is to give teachers ideas that do not require a curriculum purchase and do not require board approval to implement. That you hear the idea, you walk into your classroom and you implement it the next day.
And then I guess same as last year, will you be sending out the text of the lectures as well?
Indeed. So last year there was 8 lectures. This year there's 9, and I'm giving 8 lectures, and then a colleague of mine is delivering a 9th on entitled "How to Teach Latin Less Unclassically." He was my kid's Latin teacher. He's fantastic. I can't wait for everybody to hear him. So the text of his lecture won't be going out, but the text of all 8 of my lectures will be going out as a PDF. So if you hear something in the lecture that you're intrigued by, you can find it easily later. If you're persuaded by the argument in the lecture, you've got a text of the argument that you can deliver in your own school and pretend that it's yours. I want the ideas in the lectures to disseminate, and so trying to make that as easy as possible for everyone.
And is Gibbs Classical the best place for people to go to sign up for that?
It is, yeah. GibbsClassical.com, and then hit the conference button at the top. Should take you to the conference schedule with descriptions of all of the lectures. and then the registration as well.
Sure. And I'm sure I've said it, but the three of us went attended last year. It was it's incredible material. And then that,
thank you.
Just, in honesty of not being able to attend all of them as they're happening live, just getting, you send out the videos too, don't you? Like you would get all that content links afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that plus getting the text of it was just a huge benefit. So
Awesome.
We really enjoyed it.
So pleased to hear that.
Yeah. And trying to think what else, I mean, again, you do so much. Your short introduction to classical Christian education is also very good, but
thank you.
Again, probably podcast for another day, but
yeah, that one just came out 3 months ago, maybe. I think.
Is it excerpts from Love What Lasts? It feels it's similar content.
There's no copy and pasted line,
of course.
But it's similar. Yeah, I always say short intro to classical Christian education is a lot of the central ideas of Love What Lasts, presented with a particular angle towards classical Christian education. So Love What Lasts was a kind of conscious attempt to make a defense of classical things. It's really not staked in classical Christian education. Like I would love for Love What Lasts to get beyond the classical Christian world and for people just in the broader Christian world to read it. So it's not Love What Lasts is not a book about why you should send your kids to a classical Christian school. It's about how you determine what your family and what your kids listen to, what you read, how you spend your time, what clothes you buy, whether you ask for a kids menu when you go to a restaurant. The term is embarrassing and humbling, but Love What Lasts is really a lifestyle book. Whereas the short introduction to classical Christian education is what an interest in older things or a preference for older things has to do with classical Christian education. And what classical Christian education has to do with the concept of old things and why classical Christian schools revolve around old things, as well as what the word Christian means when we talk about classical Christian education. Because normally if you throw the word Christian in front of something, it means it's trash.
Christian music, Christian movies,
Christian, right? Like like the point is made in the pamphlet. No one thinks of Bach as Christian music. Everyone thinks of Bach as classical music. Everyone thinks of Dante as classical poetry. And yet these things could be described as Christian things. But normally when we use the word Christian to describe something, we mean like pop Christian, this or that. And it's kind of ephemeral, and it's here today and gone tomorrow. And so I think it's fair to ask, if you don't know anything about classical Christian education, is the Christian part just make it like CCM music and missions trips with the youth group and youth group Sunday where some 17-year-old kid preaches the sermon? Like, is that really what the word Christian means when you refer to classical Christian education, or is it something fundamentally different? And it is something fundamentally different. And so the pamphlet offers an explanation for that.
Sure. And if anyone's interested in that, you recorded an audio version of that for, I hate to recommend another podcast, but the Anchored podcast that's put out by
CLT.
CLT.
You can hear the whole thing before you buy it.
Yeah, but that's excellent. Obviously, but what people need to do is go out and buy the book, which is Circe Institute the best place for people to go and pick up the book?
Circe Institute is the best place to buy Love What Lasts. GibbsClassical.com is the only place where you can buy the pamphlets, though.
Perfect.
And it's the only place where you can get a registration for the conference.
Perfect. But everyone should go into GibbsClassical.com. Everyone should pick up Love What Lasts from the Circe Institute. Josh, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
oh man, thank you. Thank you so much.
Hope to have you back on again.
I'd love it.